Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and had a chance to grab a slice of that amazing looking 30th birthday cake. So welcome to this high-level session, Green and Resilient, where we're going to be asking, is it realistic to say goodbye to a fossil-based economy? And what's the role for the pulp and paper industry in that? Over the next hour and a half, we're going to be hearing from the Commission, as well as Cepi's chairman and vice chairman. But now I would like to welcome onto the stage, ladies and gentlemen, Cepi's Director General, Jori Ringman.
Hello, Naomi.
Jori, welcome. Good to see you. Now, the last time we met was a year ago. A lot can happen in a year, can't it?
Yes, I think a lot has changed. The first thing that comes to my mind is the word of the year, which is permacrisis. So a year ago it was still online, and now we have the chance of seeing these wonderful people face to face because the COVID crisis has released, but we have then multiple other crises with us, notably, of course, the energy crisis. And that is sort of leading to the other thing that I noticed, that a year ago we were still quite optimistic about the bioeconomy in Europe. But now it seems to be that we are moving backwards, or more relying on fossil materials and fossil energy.
So what next then? Will we see radical change to move away from fossil fuel dependence?
Well, maybe not answering your question directly, but indirectly, I'm quite envious about our colleagues in the US. Because a few weeks ago, President Biden signed an executive order to say that by 2030, the bioeconomy should be 1/3 of the global economy, worth $30 trillion. And to do that, they have ordered all the administration to give 360-degree support for bioeconomy, biotechnology, biomanufacturing. And this is highly exciting. So they really want to scale it up and make it happen.
Yeah, there really is, as you say, sort of commitment across the spectrum. And of course, it's going to be a huge boost for green job creation, green growth. How would you say that Europe is doing in comparison to the US?
Well, I know that there are colleagues from the Commission in the room as well, but if I'm trying to be polite, I think they are making these investments happen. And Green Deal that was supposed to be the growth strategy for Europe, I don't think it has exactly that kind of teeth.
And is there a chance for competition between Europe and the US? How do you see that?
Well, if you think about this area of bioeconomy that I just mentioned, I would imagine that there's, first of all, lots of opportunities for collaboration. But luckily for us, we have some competitive advantages here. So first of all, we have technology lead for this area already in Europe. We have skilled workforce. We have lots of funding for innovation and research and development. We have these 139 biorefineries in our sector that are a good starting point for getting to this bioeconomy. And I think that's quite unique. In addition, in our sector in particular, we have something that I really like, and it's this approach to seeing everything as a potential for value added. So any biostreams, any residues, we always think what to make out of it.
Okay, so if I were to ask you then to name one product that demonstrates the utilization of biostreams, what would it be?
Naomi, that's not fair to ask only one product because there are so many wonderful things. All the companies have many, and then it's just amazing. But if I have to think of one, I was just a few weeks ago in Portugal, and then I heard a wonderful story about there's a kraft mill that uses pine wood to make kraft pulp, but out of the residues, they produce also pine oil.
Uh-huh.
And with that pine oil, they do something quite magical. Do you guess what?
I have no idea. No idea.
How would you? But do you recognize this?
Well, I certainly do, yes. Chanel number 5.
So apparently, and I have to admit that I don't know much about Chanel. That's beyond my competency.
I can help you there, it's fine.
But it's something that gives the fresh smell component. One of the many secrets of Channel 5 is this.
It really is incredible. So it's the pine oil that's produced as a byproduct that's used. Do you have the pine oil at all? Can we see that?
Yes, I have. It doesn't look as exciting as that, but this is the starting point.
Wow.
But don't put it behind your ears.
No,
I think this is better.
This one, but Yeah, not such a secret ingredient anymore. Now we know what's
No,
behind it, but that
no.
really is amazing. I'm not sure many
But I
people
can see
know
why
that.
Marilyn chose this and not that.
I love it. Well, I have to say, knowing that we're talking about French perfume when it comes to the bioeconomy, I definitely see the potential of the bioeconomy. And
Yeah, you wouldn't have guessed that the old, boring pulp and paper industry is
no,
doing
I think
something
it's
like this. Yeah.
fantastic. And there's a link to energy as well, I believe.
There is all kinds of energy. This is kind of energy as well, I guess. But what is interesting is that we are also champions in energy efficiency in our sector. And the more we are energy efficient, the more of these buy streams that we used to use for making energy for ourselves is available for making these value-added products. So not only this Channel 5, but many, many others. And I see also a link to this example from the US to biomanufacturing. Because I would personally at least want to see that with these residues, these buy streams we have, that we could be the champions in Europe for biomanufacturing. And we have what it takes. I think it's quite clear. I also love the idea that the craft process, which is now 150 years old roughly, was invented to mimic nature. So to solve the raw material crisis that was then, when suddenly there was so much demand for paper, there was mimicking of what nature does. And now linking to that, this biomanufacturing would be, I think, very good next step.
Absolutely. And what do you think it would take then for us to see something like Biden's executive order here in Europe?
Well, obviously something that Cepi should be advocating for the next commission to do, but since the EU copied, for example, the CHIPS Act from the US, so maybe the next commission can also copy this initiative.
And of course, advocacy is something that Cepi's been doing for a long time, 30 years, in fact.
It is. Well, you mentioned we had the cake for the occasion. We are 30 years
I
old
think it was
now.
very good, by the way, so do try it if you haven't yet.
And those who didn't have it, run after the session to see if there's something left. But yes. So I would like to, of course, keep on looking to the future rather than looking back. But it's of course, a moment where you can stop and also have a look backwards. And I think what has really struck me is that politics has changed in these 30 years.
How do you see that it's changed?
Well, the key for an organization like Cepi is that the facts and the data has no longer the role it used to have. So 30 years ago, it was also the start of the EU internal market. And then organizations like Cepi were needed to have the world-class data and the technical support for getting these many, many very technical directive and standards adopted. And this is, of course, still very much needed, but no longer enough.
Well, in that case, if that's changing, how do you see that Cepi's advocacy will need to change?
Well, what I personally would like to see is that we would spell out our values and explain our values much more than what we do now. I think we have lots of values, and actually it's a conservative sector, but we have very radical potential for our production and products. And this we don't communicate very well. So I think if the policies are now more driven by political beliefs, we would be more successful in getting through this data and expertise if we started by explaining how our values are connected to the goals of the policy. And this we don't do so much. And I think we have a chance of doing that because in the end we are very much aligned with the goals of the Green Deal. Sure. But we are not maybe still able to explain it very well. And I would actually challenge all of you, and in particular, of course, our business leaders, to be more outspoken about your values. Because I know you have values. I know our values are very solid and good, and we just don't explain it.
Well, you heard the challenge. And Jori, if I may, then can I throw that back to you? Can you spell out your values and Cepi's values?
Why do you have all these unfair questions to me?
My job. It's my job.
Well, the first one that comes to the mind is, of course, sustainability. You know that everybody is since 30 years now talking about sustainability, but originally it was an old forestry term coined 300 years ago. So we have been having that in our DNA for 300 years. Wow. The second one is responsibility. So we are very responsible, we are acting responsible, we are championing responsible action. And as champions, we are humble. That would be the third value. So humble champions, they always are ready to challenge themselves and raise the bar.
Now, we do have the Commission here, and we'll be hearing from later on our panel discussion. What do you want them to hear?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the next Commission will face 4 big challenges. So the challenge of climate change, the challenge of energy, raw material challenge, and then the strategic autonomy challenge. And in all these, our sector can be helping the Commission to get over these challenges. So in climate challenge, we are not only reducing our own emissions, all the sectors, all the economy has to do that. But we're also supplying the economy with products that are helping the whole economy to decarbonize. So that's quite unique. Then in energy, we are more and more growing to produce our own energy, so be part of the solution there as well. And actually right after this session, there will be explanation on what is the extra potential that we can tap into. And in raw materials and in strategic autonomy, we are very much an industry made in Europe, so sourced, manufactured, recycled in Europe with European technology. So if strategic autonomy is needed, we are the sector for that.
Well, certainly on that, your companies are investing hugely in Europe. What support do they need with that?
Indeed, it's actually investing twice as much as manufacturing sectors on average in Europe. And in Europe, I think 2 things immediately. So safeguarding our competitiveness is really important, and this is really key now when we see the global situation. And the second one is really important and unique for Europe, that we need to have regulatory stability. So this has been lacking for so long time in Europe, that for the future investments this would be needed. And then maybe one more thing.
And what's that?
So you remember that there was just recently this COP27 for the climate change in Egypt. And in a few weeks' time there will be COP for biodiversity. But there's no international agreement on how to find this sustainable balance for bioeconomy. So if this 1/3 of the global economy will be bioeconomy, I think it would be worth having an international agreement to have this balanced view on bioeconomy. And maybe this is another goal for the future Commission.
Something we can mention as well. Now, just before I let you go, in a moment we're going to be hearing in our keynote speech about where we're at halfway through delivering on the Green Deal. Is the industry on track?
I think we are really a champion industry in all these Green Deal KPIs that you can think of. We are, of course, the lead industry in circularity, and really committed to take it still further. And in the climate change and in energy, we are again in our own class. So we have reduced 15% our energy consumption over 2005, and also in the same time reduced our climate change emissions by 34%. And we still have a lot to do, but this is a good milestone to say that we are already on the track and then ready to take the challenge for getting to the...
Sure, a lot to do, but a good milestone indeed. Jori, many thanks for setting the scene and the tone for our high-level session. Ladies and gentlemen, Director General of Cepi,
Thank you.
Jori Ringman. Now we're going to be hearing from our keynote speaker. You may be expecting to hear from Alexandra Tomczak, who is on the programme, member of cabinet from Franz Timmermans' cabinet. We had a last-minute cancellation, but we are delighted that instead we are going to be bringing you a journalistic perspective. Of course, I'm happy about that. And we're going to be welcoming to the stage the former Financial Times columnist and founder of EuroIntelligence. I hope you're all getting his blog, Wolfgang Münchau, who's going to be giving us a midterm report on the European Green Deal. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Naomi, for the introduction, and thank you, Jori, for the invitation. I spoke to a group of yours a couple of years ago, and it was unfortunately on Zoom, and so I'm so glad that we can do this in person. I remember looking at a lot of empty screens on my Zoom screen. I didn't see anybody. They all saw me. It was mortifying. Now, the idea of a midterm report is a bit highfalutin. So I have to. I'm giving you a journalistic perspective on the Green Deal, and it doesn't. You know, I'm not claiming any completeness, and many of you know so much more. And just heard from Jori, you know so much more about many technical issues than I do. I can give you a political perspective, and an international perspective, if that I hope may be helpful. Now, the Green Deal shows the EU at its best and at its worst. At its best in the sense that it is a long-term plan, is an awful lot of bottom-up planning. A lot of things are happening that go beyond the term of this one commission. Many detailed work is being done in committees and technical committees and product product-specific groups that will, I remember that when before the whole thing started, we had very crude taxonomies about what constitutes green investment. I remember we taking the mickey out of some of these decisions when, you could technically invest in a coal mine and have a sort of a vegetarian canteen next to it, and you could claim this to be a green business, or at least you could claim some. I think it was 20% of a green business. I think we have become a bit more sophisticated about how we sort of classify green investment. There is still a bit of this is still not a. I would not say that the classification is is perfect. The recovery fund was also supposed to have a lot of green content, and that was in fact very difficult to achieve because it's a massive investment program, and countries in some countries were really struggling to find investments, let alone find a 35% quota of green investments. So there certainly has been some, I'd say some creative reclassification done. But be it as it may, it's still there. It is a start, and it's being it's sort of the don't make the good the enemy of the best, and I think that's sort of the approach one should take. So in that sense, I'm optimistic. The sense where I'm less optimistic is some stuff that we've seen sort of recently. I mean, you've shown the picture of President Biden signing the executive order. We've also had the Inflation Reduction Act from the United States, a massive subsidy, but especially a regulatory response to allow companies to set up shop in the United States under what Europeans would call unfair competition rules. If you look at the response, and I've seen the French and German economy ministers having met to discuss this, they haven't come up with any. They've been saying this is against the WTO rules, which I think it probably is. But we don't have the ability to do the same. And why is that? It's not only that we don't have a president, but it's also we have a competition policy. We have a fiscal stability pact. We have significantly less scope for shifting resources from one part of the EU to the other, as the Americans have. And this was basically, this was a federal decision. I mean, we could say, okay, we give money to certain industries, also certain, we would subsidize industries. We throw out all our competition principles. Governments spend the money. This doesn't count towards your Maastricht deficit. It's not going to happen. The number of rules we would have to reform in the EU, the treaty change, that's not even a rule change, it's a treaty change, is completely unrealistic. So we are at a disadvantage in this specific thing. Now, this is not a Green Deal, be very clear, but it is something that intrudes. And I think that is basically my main theme, that when you have a long-term plan, and obviously our long-term plan started with the climate change, with the Paris climate change target that were then translated into EU targets and member state targets and various industry decisions like the abolition of the fuel-driven car in 2035. All these things, when you make these very long-term plans and you see something has intruded, and I think one has to consider and reconsider some of those decisions one has taken. For example, something industry I'm following. I'm not following your industry as much as I follow, for example, the car industry, which has been a very late, in Europe at least, very late convert to the idea of electric batteries. But now that they are shifting in that direction, they are doing this at the expense of all other potential alternative technologies. I mean, we have seen one of the big shifts that have happened is not only the war in Ukraine, but also a repositioning of the West vis-à-vis China. This is now taking place in all the countries. The British Prime Minister yesterday outlined his new China policy. Joe Biden has imposed, or his administration has imposed, semiconductor sanctions. He's now calling on the Dutch to follow suit, because the Dutch are the main producer of semiconductor machinery, the lithography machines that are badly needed in the manufacturing of these very high performance semiconductor chips. So Europe gets drawn into this US policy on sanctions on China. The problem for us will be is that if our car industry will be based entirely on electric vehicles by 2035, we will have a massive need for imports on electric batteries and on rare earths and various metals that are needed in the production of these batteries, and on which China has I wouldn't say a monopoly, but something approaching a monopoly. So the question here is our geostrategic policy, our geopolitical policy has changed in the last 2 years, but our climate change, our Green Deal has not adjusted accordingly. And this is the problem when you set long-term micro targets. This is, we're talking about sort of a lot of micromanagement here. I'm not doubting the 55% target, but is the 2035 target for cars, is this the right way to go? And I would say, I'm not so sure that it is in view of the current situation. For example, we could have one thing that happened because of the change to electrical cars is that we have given up all research into the 2 liter per 100 kilometer, consumption engine. That would have been on the cards, a much lower engines. It will be difficult for hydrogen because hydrogen may not be ready by then, and hydrogen, it's sort of the classic, what's the classic dominant technology trap. If the dominant technology is the battery, and we have invested as countries and as the EU into power, into charging stations on all our streets and motorways, it will be very difficult for us to build a similar network infrastructure for hydrogen. So, we won't be able to do one or the other, but by forcing the issue now, we're actually forcing the technology. And that is something where we, I think, should be probably more modest in our assumptions of what will be the next generation technology. I don't know what it is, but I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not convinced from what I've seen that the next generation technology the optimal technology will be one that is from batteries that require products or raw materials that are rare and on which countries have a monopoly that we have classified as economic competitors. I think this is something where we have to do some sort of second thinking about. The other problem that occurs in any policy, and is sort of also an intent, and I've just alluded to this in the car example, sort of an intent to do too much micromanagement in a goal. I'm in favor of reaching goals and letting countries follow their own way, and also because technologies will shift. Bill Gates, I don't often agree with him, but he was right. And if our climate change problem is ever solved, it is likely due to technology, and mostly due to technology that we don't even think about at this stage. So this is probably this probably would speak against a very heavy-handed approach. And the other thing that I've seen is when we conduct policies, and the EU has had tremendous successes like the single market or the customs union. There has been a long history of extremely successful policies, but there's also been a long history of some pretty unsuccessful policies that were considered to be a very big deal at the time. If you might remember the Lisbon agenda, that actually didn't change much, but it was a preoccupation here in Brussels. When I lived in Brussels, sort of in the period from 2003 to 2011, everybody, that was the big talking point in virtually every economic meeting. That didn't get anywhere. Jean-Claude Juncker's investment plan, that wasn't much. So we have to be careful about the kind of agendas that have an ultimate success. And my experience is that the success is mostly guaranteed if it's based on solid legal foundation, especially treaty change. I mean, virtually all the success, like the single market, it started with a treaty change. Then there was then there were various deadlines that followed the treaty change to implement programs, and the program is still ongoing. And the success of the program wasn't really visible in the early days, but it's become more visible as time passed by. And the same I would assume would be the case with the agenda. But in order to make this agenda more successful, it will require both a different approach, one that is less focused on achieving sort of intermediate targets, or intermediate, or at presupposing one knows how it's going to happen, but that at the same time has more flexibility in terms of responding to something what just happened in America. And I fear what is going to happen, and this is why my outlook isn't all that positive and that optimistic. Why my fear is that what's going to happen is that we are going to be we have this long-term approach, and then the Americans come up with this Inflation Reduction Act, which they didn't really think through, which violates all sorts of international laws, but that might damage our industry, and that might ultimately also damage our ability to fulfill our own targets. And that's something where we need to be, where we need to have a second thoughts about the program and about the way this ultimately, the way we should approach this theme. I'm a mathematician by training and a journalist by profession, and one thing I have learned in my, I've dealt a lot with European economic issues, and one thing I have learned is to be very careful with numbers. Numbers can deceive. I thought the science community did itself no favor, not only by communicating the 1.5%, the 1.5 degree global warming as the threshold, as the average increase in the global temperature as the threshold, because humans do not understand averages. This is something which I know as a journalist, but also as a mathematician, I know that the average is only one of many statistics. You want to look at medians, you want to look at variances. I recall a colleague of mine once written an entire column on the fact that 1.5 degree warmer would be fantastic for Great Britain, and because it gets it, it makes it a little warmer. And that guy was serious, and it's, he obviously didn't think about variances and the weather extremes that are the real feature of climate change. It's not an average that is the real feature, it is an extremes. And we die in cold weather or hot weather or storms. We don't die when the temperature rises by 1.5%. So we need to be careful when we look at numbers. The EU has a history of getting boxed in with numbers. I remember the Stability Pact, the Maastricht Treaty had the 3% deficit rule and the 60% debt rule, and they were based on situations that existed at the time. There were certain average numbers that occurred in those times that made sure that 3% and 60% made sense. They don't now, because the economy's changed, the real growth has changed. When you were to redraft it based on the same methodology, you would come up with very different figures. And the conclusion I've drawn is never put numbers into constitutions. Always put principles in, because numbers change. For us to focus on a 55% reduction target, this is maybe this is how Brussels works, and maybe this is how it needs to be done. I would be more careful about these sort of global targets. It's something that I find, I think as a guideline, definitely, since this is also the international standard, but I would not go statically in terms of it means 30% this year and 35% this year, and then going into a sort of and treating this as a very mathematical thing. If you take the bigger picture, where are we still short in our global fight on climate change? Well, the biggest CO2 emitter is China, followed by the United States. If you look at what are the sectors, now that we are all moving to renewables, what is the next sector that needs to be done? It is agriculture. And that is a sector on which the EU has control, but which is not on our list. So then the question becomes, especially livestock agriculture. The opportunity for deep agricultural reform was missed at the last opportunity a couple of years ago when the issue arose. So we should probably, my plea would be to rethink strategies, rethink priorities, and rather than follow with the existing path. Not that I think it's all worthless. A lot of good work is happening on the grounds. Even at the ECB, which I watch very closely, a lot of investments are now being reclassified as green. But my plea would be to take stock. A lot of things have changed since the Green Deal started, and I don't think we can continue in exactly the same way as we did. Thank you very much.
Wolfgang, thank you so much for such a considered and insightful analysis for that mathematical and journalistic perspective. And I know that you're going to be staying with us for the panel discussion, so if you wanted to have a seat. Thank you so much. Now, we did have a very carefully planned half male, half female panel, but we had another very last minute cancellation, and Katarina Napton-Felix from DG Grow is unable to be here, so I hope you'll forgive the gender imbalance. But we are so pleased that Hans Ingels, who's head of unit Bioeconomy, Chemicals, Cosmetics of DG Grow, has agreed to step in, so I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Hans, if you'd like to take a seat, along with Cepi's chairman and CEO of Metsä Group, Ilkka Hämälä, and Cepi vice chairman and CEO of Sappi, Marco Eikelenboom. Please, gentlemen, have a seat. There we are. A warm welcome to all of you. Good to have you here. I'd like to pick up on some of the points that Wolfgang made in that very thought-provoking keynote there. The Green Deal targets were there before we had a war in Ukraine, energy crisis. You mentioned we've got the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't know the impact of that. Is it still realistic to say goodbye to the fossil fuel economy? Are we going to meet the targets? Marco, you first, from a business perspective, what are you seeing right now?
What I see is I'll take my microphone, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll share those out.
Works. No, what I see is that the ambition is way too big to say goodbye because of this enormous impactful event as the Ukraine war is. I think Jori has said as well that this industry has a very particular advantage and a true benefit if it comes to circular economy and bioeconomy for that sense. So I don't see any of the ambitions change. Do we need to react differently? Yes. One of the examples is that in Germany, the government has very much stimulated burning coal in the short term to reduce the dependency on Russian gas, which of course goes diagonally against the sustainability ambitions that we have. And therefore, I liked very much Wolfgang's expose on averages. A blueprint is the same. A blueprint is only as strong as the geopolitical will of member states, but also what is happening around you. So sometimes you need to mitigate some of these actions, and that is what's happening right now. But does it change the ambitions? Absolutely not.
Okay, not changing it. And if there's a microphone there if you want to. We've got 3, so we've just about got enough. I know you're a little outnumbered here, and I want to be clear for everyone that the Commission's an administration of many departments, and those who are driving this Green Deal unfortunately dropped out of our panel. And you bring DG Grow's perspective, which is what we're really keen to hear. You have been put in the role of defending the Commission, though. So is there a need to rethink the solution pathways, in particular related to energy, that have already been set in the Green Deal?
Not really, Mark.
Or is that?
It works.
Try it
Yes, it
closer?
works.
Yes.
Okay, good. It works. You can hear me. Not really, in my view. We had many crises recently. We had crisis in 2016, 2018. We had the banking crisis before. We had the COVID crisis. Now we've got the Ukraine crisis. We consider this as a reason to accelerate, rather. But with European industry, because European industry should be at the center of our thinking here. And this is what you see around you. So we shouldn't lower our ambitions necessarily. No, this is just an opportunity. It's a threat, but it's also an opportunity for all of us to think about open strategic autonomy. So what can we do to support European industry in the first place? Because the European industry will be the centerpiece of the European Green Deal. And I think to disagree a bit with Wolfgang about targets and so on. You need targets. You need ambition. You need to look somewhere in the future to know and set your specific targets. But what you need to also do is to allow industry to adapt. The industry needs time to adapt and needs time to plan. So the transition is something that needs to be planned quite carefully. Sometimes, and there I must admit, and there you're fair to criticize the European Commission, sometimes we're a bit too ambitious. Sometimes our timelines are a bit too short. But there also, this is one of the advantages of the EU. We've got a system of checks and balances. At the end of the day, you always see that thanks to the interventions of all kind of institutions like the European Parliament, like the Council, like all kind of lobbying groups. At the end of the day, we get it right. And at the end of the day, what I see in Europe is that sometimes we're a bit too modest. And we're simply, you see what the US is doing, but in certain things like the bioeconomy, I think we're light years ahead of the US. We've done a lot of things, but we're simply too modest. We simply don't talk about it. We don't mention them. It's somewhere hidden, somewhere in, and this is what probably as the EU we should do much more. We should try to be proud of our achievements, especially on the bioeconomy. If you see what we're doing and how many billions that we're spending on the bioeconomy, it's enormous. And there, EU is, I think, much better than the US.
So the targets are a good thing and we should keep them as they are.
Precisely.
Ilkka, how your thoughts on that?
I very much share the same thinking, so that the longer term targets are not to be changed, or if they are changed, they are to be changed stricter when you are finding new ways to proceed. For example, in our company we have about 30 industrial sites all over Europe. And we set 2018 target so that we are not using any fossil fuels in any of our sites for any energy production. And I don't see any reason to change these kind of targets. You can even accelerate the development when you find new solutions and you are able to do new investments.
Okay, so we're agreed that we want to meet the climate goals, to accelerate. What is the role of the pulp and paper industry then in that? Marco, come back to you. Jori talked about how there's radical potential in the sector that's very much aligned with the green transition goals, but you don't communicate that well as an industry. So what would you say you are doing well already, and what support do you need?
Well, let me first say that Jori is absolutely right. This industry has transformed itself from being a part of the problem to becoming a part of the solution. And I think we all truly believe in the assets and the potential that this industry has. Ilkka was already talking about the biofuel. There is hardly any pulp and paper company that is not using either biomass or biodiesel or self-generated energy. So we're not yet at a level of self-sufficiency, but with renewable, biodegradable, and the biomaterial, we're getting a very long way to self-sufficiency and having our own circular household, our own circular economy. Your second point, I couldn't agree more, and Hans already said it on a European platform. I think indeed Europe is way better than what many people tend to think. It's very impressive what President Biden did in September, and it certainly sets the minds. If you talk about an executive order and an ambition to get a 30 trillion economy on its way. I don't know the European numbers, but I'm pretty sure that we have that we could have similar ambitions here, not to the same extent, but at least the direction and the speed. And you're right, the industry will need to follow. We will need to learn to be thought leaders on much more than only pulp and paper. It is all around circularity, bioeconomy, energy self-sufficiency, and that's what we need to get across. I've said it before. This is a game. If you do not sit at the table, you might become part of the menu, and I think that is what we need to prevent.
Mm-hmm. Hans, I saw you nodding along there. Just nodding. Yeah. Wolfgang, I wanted to bring you in. You talked about the need for investment rather than targets, particularly for these innovative technologies to come. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. Let me just to be clear. I was not against targets. I was against an agglomeration of numbers, and that is the
okay.
That is
Thank you.
From the fact that the overall 55% reduction target is a global target to which everybody agreed. I agree to it too.
Sure.
The question is how we get there and the various paths that we should take. My question was also not directed at the Commission specifically. It was directed at the EU, its broader approach, of which the Commission is part, but not necessarily always responsible for. When we put things in treaties, that is not necessarily what the Commission has done. Now, the Maastricht Treaty was the work of a much broader group of people. To your question, technology, I think, is key. And we have to be very modest about technology. If I consider 20 years ago, I remember there was in the early, during the sort of the dot-com crisis, there was a huge optimism about nanotechnology, about sort of chemical nanotechnologies, and that it would be around the corner, and it wasn't. It was a hype. Then there were other incipient technologies like social media that were completely disregarded at the time. So I think our ability as individuals to forecast, the next generation of technological developments. I think, Steve Jobs was very good at that, but I have to say I'm not that good at that. And I remember my most famous prediction was in 2007 when I saw the first iPhone and said this will never fly. So this is about the level at which my ability is limited, and I think a lot of people may not be quite as extreme, but it's difficult. So there may be technologies, or there will be technologies we don't know. I've taken a sort of an interest in hydrogen, and I've seen the problems with hydrogen, but the promise is massive, and I know the Commission supports it, and I know especially the German government supports it. Olaf Scholz said it was it is a potentially key technology of the future. And it would allow us. We would still have an electric car. It was just not driven by a battery, but it would be driven by a different source of energy. There are still many problems, including and the most important being safety. This thing is highly explosive. But it could be another technology that will come along, and that would help us. And there may be other ways of producing some of these rare earths. There is an awful lot of nickel extraction technologies going on and stuff. So there is a plethora of which it's quite difficult to actually keep an overview. So I would probably not rephrase this target as having to get rid of a particular technology by 2035. If the car industry were to able to, and they have stopped research into the low consumption cars because they shifted resources into the electrical cars, which is perfectly understandable given the targets. But I would have probably not given up on this older technology, having stricter fuel. If they can produce the 1 liter car, this is 1 liter consumption per 100 kilometer. I think why not? I'd rather have the 1 liter car than a shortage of electrical cars because we can't get the batteries or we can't get the semiconductors for certain components that we need. So I would keep it more flexible while observing the overall direction, but allow for more flexible ways of achieving it. Because I think otherwise, you've seen, since we spoke 2 years ago, we've had the lockdown. That was in the middle of the lockdown. We've had the Ukraine thing. We've now had the sanctions against China. China's becoming an increasingly problematic issue for us because the EU is squeezed between the US position and its great dependencies on exports to China. I think the Commission has been trying to drive a middle way. I do remember there are those who just want to do business with China and not think about it, and there are those who just don't want to do any business with China and just basically want to subjugate all foreign policy interests to human rights. And I think there is a case to choose a middle way, and that has to be done intelligently. So I think there is a European case to do this, and for our own sort of, especially if we want to meet those targets, we will need a different relationship.
Keeping with the investment there as well, just for a moment to get the sort of view of this industry. You're one of the biggest industry investors in Europe. We're talking about these innovative technologies that could be coming through. How do you see the industry's role in meeting the climate goals, but also what's needed for more investment to happen in the EU?
Well, I think the challenge when designing investments is the stability of the environment that where we are working, and the stability of the regulation is very important. And like you said, so we have been investing quite a lot recently. I would guess that during the last decade, so we have been the biggest investor in Europe for forest-based industry, and that has meant risk-taking because the regulatory environment for sure has not been stable. But basically we have thought that, okay, we can do investments that fulfill these basic ideas where we should be doing. So basically, when we are doing investment, we must find this kind of a paths that are matching the needs of the societies. So that basically you can support the targets of the societies, and that should be then supported by stable regulation, and then you can develop your industries to find the markets for your goods. I think that in the forest industry it's a good thing, so that what we are producing we are targeting to people's everyday lives. So basically we know, we can estimate how the consumption patterns of people are developing, what kind of goods people are needing for their everyday life, excluding the Channel 5, which is only on weekends. but basically, we do not have to invent this kind of new needs. We can invent new products, materials to replace fossil materials, like this jacket behind me, which is made of wood. So wood is an old product in textile, but there are several new different processes to produce these materials more sustainably, matching the society's needs. So basically, stability and capability to answer the society's needs.
Well, let's talk more about this, because I'd like to speak to how we accelerate scaling up, getting on the market, these renewable low carbon products. You've mentioned this amazing, beautiful looking jacket. It really is gorgeous. Let's take that as an example. What stands in the way of scaling up and what's needed?
Well, basically in this case, so if you think about this wood-based textiles, so like I said, so many companies are active there. There is huge demand on markets because basically now what we are replacing is fossil-based materials, and that is what people need. People want to get rid of fossil materials. But then you need very long-term research work to be able to do that switch so that you can meet the quality needs, the material technical needs, and also the economical needs. So, and that needs also to support and let's say the public funding for research and innovation works. Like this material, this process that this jacket has been produced. So we have started by doing very wide cooperation with the universities. And we have university partners both in Finland and in Germany who have been creating this. So creating new products and coming into market and making this green transition to happen. So there has been a very wide cooperation about different organizations bringing their own knowledge into the table.
It's great to hear what's going on in the background and this collaboration. Marco, I believe that you have also brought something to show us and tell us about and use an example of what gets in the way of scaling up, what's needed.
Yeah, thank you. Probably somewhat less exciting than Ilkka's jacket or the Chanel's 5, but closer to home. It is all around food packaging, and I'm looking to my neighbor at the left side, not necessarily involved, but very close to the single-use plastic directive, most likely. And I'm looking to his left side neighbor because I'm going to mention a couple of numbers, and this is where I'm getting on thin ice. Please don't quote me. That's very difficult here. But the rough number studies indicate, and it's an indication, that the single-use plastic market, so everything that is wrapped in a plastic protection, which is only used once, is round about 32 million tons. Now, just imagine that half of that, as the European Commission would like to see, will not be packed at all. The fruits and the vegetables. Let's assume that's half. We're ambitious here. So that makes 16 million tons still to be packed. Now, if 10% of that is fiber-based or applicable for fiber-based solutions as we as an industry produce, and particularly in the food packaging environment, you talk about a market of 1.6 million tons. That is not only a threat because you need to change your mindset, you need to go from fossil packaging to fiber-based, but it's a huge opportunity. It is a massive opportunity if we do the things right. And one of the issues that you asked, what do you need? I guess is courage. You need to have the courage to make that step forward. We invested, our company Cepi invested in a barrier coater. It's a unique piece of equipment in the world. It costs an awful lot of money, and we don't know exactly how that should be operated to tackle that part of the market. But we know it's the right direction. It's erected, it is there. We're learning a lot, and it is something that will give an enormous amount of benefit in case we will make this happen. We know we had the courage to do it. We know it's the right direction. Now we need to make it happen. And maybe a last remark on that. And I liked, you said it, so I'm paraphrasing Wolfgang. Never let a perfect solution stand in the way of a very, very good alternative. The alternative that we have, if you truly look at fossil fuel compared to fiber-based solutions, it's 95% better than what we have right now. Still, in the barrier coating, there might be an amount of polymers that needs to be treated, and we need to have the innovation to get to green polymers or different types of barriers. But 95% is better than the alternative. Let the 5% not stand in the way of getting us on that track and making that direction, have the courage and the speed to develop and deliver.
I'm going to let Hans come back to that, but can we have a look at the packets, packaging?
It's all paper-based and fiber-based. Wolfgang,
Okay.
you look hungry. You know what we're talking
Oh,
about.
one for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but
thank you.
it is a natural.
These are things we
packaging.
see on our shelves. I recognize that there. It's
Yeah. Yeah, it is as close to nature as you can get.
Yeah. Thank you. Hans, I will give you a chance if you want to respond to that, or otherwise I can.
No, I fully agree with you. It's indeed, sometimes we just need the courage. And this is what we're all doing. It's a bit of a combination of the carrot and the stick. Carrot being funding and single market legislation, and the stick is then sometimes very ambitious targets, which sometimes are a bit too ambitious. We agree. But very often, what you see here is that we're already fairly advanced, because what you see in the bioeconomy, what you need is the availability of biomass. What you need is the technology. What you need is the investments, the industrialization, and what you also need is a market. We're fairly advanced as regards technology. I think Europe is really far ahead of any other continent in the world. Also, in terms of investment, there's plenty of possibilities, and what we see is many investments into innovative sectors. The main challenge, in my view, will be the availability of biomass, because this is what you will increasingly see. The demand for biomass for food, feed, the demand for biomass for biofuels, and the demand for biomass also for other purposes, for industrial purposes, but also for chemicals. So what we'll see in the future is that somehow we'll have to work much harder on the availability of biomass on the one hand, and then the other part of the spectrum is a fair competition on the market. Because as far as we can see, but I'm just a bureaucrat, but as far as I can see, there's still this kind of unfair competition between bio-based materials and the old fossil-based materials. And there it's where single market legislation could help to ensure that there's somehow a better, a more equal playing field between fossil-based and bio-based.
Thank you. Thank you. Wolfgang, I know that you've talked about how you'd like the Commission to understand how things work from a business perspective. Any thoughts on what you've just heard that you want to add to?
No, I don't think there is a fundamental conflict. I mean, as we can just hear that the innovation comes from industry, and I would actually not fault the Commission for its approach to this, because it plays a useful role in coordinating this and also setting rules and ground and regulatory environment. That also hasn't been my point, that I was trying to make. That is the good bit of what we do, and Europe has a strong innate advantage in technological advantages and in the company sector, that we could be the leading the leading proponent in the world. Where our problem is our collective action problem among governments, that individual governments have pursue primarily national interests. And the example of my country, Germany, was cited, where our government introduced a gas price cap and a national policy, and without even discussing it with anybody, and presenting it as a fait accompli, and then causing enormous problems for other countries and for the EU. That kind of behavior does happen, and it's not just Germany. There are other countries that do similar things. We don't have a habit of looking at the collective action issue before we do as our national thing. That is an innate issue, which is why the US can act faster. And I think we should look at this Inflation Reduction Act as a warning that we have we're starting in a very, very, very good position. We've invested we've made investments. We also have many industries in these sectors, but this stuff is powerful. It could cause damage. It could entice, I'm not sure whether it could entice any industries that are present here, but it could certainly entice some companies to switch location. Some of these subsidies are very attractive. And this is not just marginal stuff. It's not just also the money, it's also the way regulation works. You're operating in a much, and I think this is a big deal, to which I think the EU should respond more than by just raising a WTO case. Yeah.
Hans, is there a sense of the impact there could be from this? Should there be more steps taken by the EU?
Should be. I'm not so sure. What I hear in general from many people is that the Green Deal is already sufficiently ambitious. But there's still opportunity to accelerate, and this is where we'll try to cooperate with Cepi to see how we can accelerate, and we'll discuss this also with Cepi in the near future. But my message here is that there's so many opportunities still out there, and we're still being too modest. Just let me ask, who knows the circular bio-based Europe joint undertaking? Lift your hand. Who knows it? Who knows it? You see, we've got circular bio-based Europe joint undertaking, which spends more than $1 billion on a bioeconomy. And even because in my previous job, I was responsible for free movement of goods, single market legislation. And now when I moved to the bioeconomy, I discovered also the existence of the joint undertaking. And nobody knows it, but we're spending a fortune on the bioeconomy. And this is also where there's something which could be extremely relevant for forest-based industries, pulp and paper. Because there you see there's a lot of very interesting projects coming out with a quite high technology readiness level. Have a look at the website. It's CBE, the joint undertaking. And Europe, because when I looked at the Biden Act, I said, we'll learn something. And this is the nice thing, you try to learn something. But I didn't learn anything from the Bioeconomy Act in the US. It's more or less a simple version of what we are doing on the joint undertaking. It's a simple version of what we're doing on the Horizon Europe. But we're just being too modest here.
Okay, thank you.
We as Europe, we as EU. And this is all of us. This is also European industry is sometimes far too modest. We should do a bit more like the Americans and say, we're important. We're doing good things here in Europe, and be proud of it. Tell more about our success stories.
Thank you. Marco and Ilkka, I know that you are both CEOs of companies that are global and huge, but local in production in Europe. So I want to get your global perspective in a minute. But before that, we heard Jori talking about how important it is to state values. So I'd like to hear yours. Marco, I'm going to come to you first. What would you say are yours and the company's values?
Well, I think I mentioned two already, which is courage and speed. But I think there's one underlying element that is incredibly important for every stakeholder that is dealing with whatever company, whether it's Ilkka's, mine, or any here in the room, and that is enhancing trust. Mm-hmm. I think we're too often still talk about the two agendas, the sustainability agenda and the economic agenda. And I think we've got a perfect example here of an industry that could combine and that can combine the two agendas. So enhancing trust, and it's internally, yes, I agree with Hans, we can have more confidence in the way we approach certain problems. But it's also enhancing trust to your counterpart, whether that's the European Commission, whether that is customers, big brand owners, who have similar problems. They're asking us, and Ilkka and all of us in the room, they're asking us for solutions. They don't have the answers, and they're putting some of the problems in our hands. And that requires an awful lot of trust. So enhancing trust in the biggest sense of the word is driving economic growth. It is driving ultimately financial ability to change and to make the transition. And it does well for the community, whether that's your own employees or the community you operate in.
Okay, thank you. Ilkka, the same question to you then on values.
Well, if I think about the values and the line, how I wish to develop the company I'm working or leading, and it comes from, let's say, my personal history. I was born in the early 60s by a pulp mill. And when I came back from the hospital with my mother, I was put to lie on a sheet of pulp. And that's a happy memory.
That's a wonderful story.
And by the way, I'm pulp engineer by trade. And my first memory from my childhood is a terrible smell on the yard. So there was snow on the yard and there was terrible smell. We were living only 500 meters from the mill. And I was living, the mill was in this kind of a city in northern part of Finland where there were 2 pulp mills and 1 chemical mill. And the state of the environment was terrible. All the coniferous wood was died from the height of 5 meters up and so forth. And the sea was smelling like a wastewater and the status was terrible. And I really at that time in the end of 60s when my memory starts to work, so I thought that okay, this world is going to end because of this environment is in this kind of a state. And that has been sort of a driving force. When we are looking to development, we must be very sincere developing different operations, industries to improve the situations where we have been doing. So we have been tackling in forest industry, wastewater questions, we have been tackling air pollution questions. Now we must be tackling the climate change questions, biodiversity needs and so forth. So we must be really be sincere in addressing these things and we must be doing true actions to improve our environment.
Thank you, thank you. So we've heard then about how the pulp and paper industry is contributing to the strategic autonomy of Europe, that it's very much made in Europe. As I said, you're both CEOs of global companies. Ilkka, then back to you. Can you give us your perspective on what you see outside Europe and how the EU sustainable industry maintains its global competitiveness? To you first and then to Marco, the same question.
Well, basically, we are in a global competition and one challenge for us is so that when we are coming with our products to different market areas, so the competition elements of competition, the cost elements, the regulatory elements, all are different. And I think that one very important thing is that we must, from our, let's say, where we are standing, what our conditions are, what our strengths are, we must select those fights on the markets, what we are going to win. So basically we do not have to try to win everything. We must be realistic and look at what kind of basic factors we have to create the competitiveness and the profitability here. And then, of course, what is often said is the level playing field with our competition. The European Union, the purpose of European Union is to create Europe to be a competitive, developing geographical area, and when creating legislation, this must be borne in mind. So we are achieving our ambitious targets with climate change and other these kind of issues, but at the same time, we must, in these political decisions, look so that the relative competitiveness to our different areas where our competitors are working is in place.
Yeah, and I very much agree. The level playing field is one thing that always needs to be kept in mind. I would just like to change the context slightly in the sense that Cepi is a South African company. It's a global company, but it has its origins in South Africa, South African pulp and paper industries, but very much spread its wings over 3 continents. Still very big with forestry and pulp in South Africa. Packaging and a little bit of graphics paper in North America, and graphic paper and specialties and packaging in Europe. So 3 distinct regions. Now the interesting thing is, if you look at the 3 regions and their background, they all act very differently on climate regulation, very, very differently. And if I start with the US, spoke about it already. What I see happening with my North American colleagues is that there's an absolute willingness to change, but there is still a sentiment of the bang for your buck. They have a DNA that they want to invest to get a return. And I'm not saying that this should be any different here in Europe, but that is the underlying value that North America is still driving. And that's why I guess Joe Biden is much more brutal, almost, and ambitious, that he's attacking the climate or the bioeconomy, or the climate by the economy. South Africa, very different perspective. That's a developing country. It's not a developed country, but it's still very much in development, sitting on huge reserves of coal, and clearly having a sentiment that you guys have done not too great for the last 100 years, and now you're telling us that the natural reserves that we have in coal cannot be used anymore. It changes your perspective. It's all understandable, but it doesn't make it any easier. And then Europe, and I call always when we have executive meetings with the regional leadership team, we are the canary in the coal mine. We will always be hit first by regulations. We need to anticipate, we need to mitigate first, because the European Commission, and rightly so, is very ambitious in its regulatory machinery, and for the right reasons. Once again, I'm not saying this as a negative. What would be the ideal, and then I'll close it off, is Europe, and one hears that statement that the biggest export product of Europe is regulatory affairs. That is one of the bigger export products if you look at it. But how beautiful, and I take your challenge, Hans, on becoming ambitious while staying realistic, if we could, from a European platform, set world standards based on this European knowledge and competence that we have built up over all these years, and setting their worldwide standards.
And I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, otherwise I can move on. Yeah,
First of all, feel free to criticize the European Commission. No, because we learned from it. We learned from it. We're just a human institution. We make errors. We make many errors, but don't quote me. So feel free to criticize. But most of the regulation is meant to create a single market, and is to have a level playing field between the different businesses. Because without it, very often you have certain member states which are way ahead of others, and which creates conditions where there are many barriers. This was my previous job. So you see all these barriers, technical barriers popping up in several member states. And this is what we try to avoid. And we try to avoid instead of having 27 different rules, and then I even forget Norway, I forget Iceland, I forget Liechtenstein, I forget Turkey, and all the countries that follow us. It's to have one single rule for the entire single market. So we're replacing 27 rules by one single. And it's true that there's a lot of things that are changing. And sometimes we get it wrong. But therefore, it's also important what you said earlier, that, and this is one of the values that we in our, at least in ours, in our service, try to encourage. Is first we listen and then we speak. And this is why it's important that you criticize what Europe is doing, and because we can always do better, we can always do more, and it's true that a number of things we're in the past that we were wrong. There are a number of things that we got right, but there's also plenty of things that we got wrong. But you cannot create a fair single market without a good, stable regulatory environment where we replace 27 different sets of rules by a single rule. And that's there we've gone with the business perspective. And this is what we're trying to do, is to have this business perspective. And often what you hear from businesses, what they want is stability and clarity. And if you want clarity, then always you have to add certain things. So very often, this is in my experience, we come forward with something that's conceived as as simple in the beginning, and then people start to add because certain things are unclear. Then you add a paragraph here, you add a paragraph there, and in the end you end up with something which is quite detailed, but which sets the rules of the game for the entire single market.
Thank you. Yeah, please, Wolfgang.
May I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
What interests me is, I mean, you have a company that's present in America and in Europe and in Africa and South Africa. Do you see any possibility that America, having clearly not the traditional technological leaders in this in environmental technologies and clearly behind in the regulation, that they nevertheless emerge as the world leader in this industry, not because, coming from behind, very similar to what happened with them in the 1960s when they took over the world of digital technologies, because of the massive spending by their military on research and development that put them into a very unique position to build up these monopoly markets.
That's a rather philosophical question.
Yeah.
But if I think about it, maybe the big difference with the 60s or the 70s or the 50s has been that America was the land of unlimited opportunities. Unlimited opportunities. Right now, we have limited opportunities, and the limits are being set by regulation, by sustainability targets, by compliance. And I think ultimately that Europe might be better placed to deal with limited opportunities than what the US 50 years ago had with unlimited opportunities.
Just quickly then, Jori also mentioned when we're talking about safeguarding global competitiveness, he put forward the idea of an international agreement on bioeconomy. Maybe Wolfgang, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
International agreements on these matters will be very, very difficult. I mean, as you've seen, Biden didn't coordinate with us. We've seen, even the German government didn't coordinate with the rest of the EU on these things. This is something which I would probably prefer to deal, certainly at the EU level, whenever the next round of treaty changes, that I would give a bigger role to the Commission in setting these things and calling these things, rather than allowing member states to do these sort of initiatives. I mean, a lot of the problems is that energy is still mostly a national policy, and that the initiative rests primarily with member states. The Commission has a coordinating role. I think a lot of stuff needs to be integrated into the into the single market. That would make things easier. On an international scale, I'm very pessimistic that we're going to achieve. The Americans are not, and we should also not assume that. We should also not take the American political majorities for granted. Biden is the president. He has another 2 years to go. He's just lost the majority in the House of Representatives. He didn't do particularly badly in those elections. But it is always possible that the opposition, the Republicans, will win the next election. If Trump were to come back, this would be, probably a disaster for the global 55% target, because he would scale back. The role of the Environmental Protection Agency and U.S. path. The antagony between China and America would become much worse. So there would probably be friction for us Europeans to decide whether our alliance with the United States can still be upheld, given the degree of coercion that we are likely to become subject to. So I don't think this would be a particularly suitable environment. Even if the Democrats were to win the next presidential elections, what Trump did and succeeded in, he did change agendas. And there are virtually the entire Republican Party is now in his sort of "Make America Great Again" vein, and that's the opposite of international coordination. The Democrats have become tougher on trade, so I'm not very positive. I'm not very optimistic of that.
What are your thoughts then about collaboration with the US? Should the EU have a strategic partnership with them?
Some people think, I know the Germans, they want now a trade deal, sort of a CETA type trade deal. I don't think that's on the card. A strategic partnership, I would probably wait and see how the politics of the United States, in which direction it pans out. I think it's sort of at the moment, people call it an inflection point or some kind of. It's a point where it could change in one or the other direction. I don't think the U.S. is ready for that yet. The question I would probably ask is whether we should have a partnership with China, a limited partnership with China and other and a post-war Russia and other countries that will also play a critical role in our battle for global climate change, and Africa. So I think there is a case for more global coordination. But as we've seen, I mean, we have these COP summits that become progressively disappointing in their outcomes. It is the history of the EU, and I think if you look back now, why has the EU succeeded, and where has it succeeded? It has succeeded in areas where it adopted majority voting. The single market, economic policy, macroeconomic policy. These are the areas where there is a firm treaty base behind it. It is not successful, not nearly as successful in areas that are subject to the national veto, like foreign policy, internal, interior policies, because there you get, veto rights, you get long procedures, long processes of agreement. International coordination is one where every country has a veto. Now, we cannot recreate the EU at a global level. I think one should probably think about this in the long run, not the EU with all its ambitions, a version of the EU at global level, which at least preserves some of these sort of, let's just put it, the internal market part of the EU. This sort of the idea of having majority voting system, supermajority voting system, where countries agree to be outvoted voluntarily in the pursuit, and where there is sort of an agenda, a commission type administration that would set agendas and that would, and where there would be sort of an assembly, a European Parliament type arrangement that would sort of control this. This can be done. This is not world government, and this is would be significantly less ambitious than the EU. But I think we're several decades away from this. So at the moment, the reality is that we basically have to lead ourselves, start strategic relationships with those who we can strike strategic relationships with. But I fear this is not the United States.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. We are coming very near to the end of our session. I want just a final question to you, if I may, Hans. You've heard the concerns, the thoughts from the industry. You have a room full of them. Any last words of perhaps advice about what people should do next so they can be heard, or any other last comment that you would like to make before we close?
The last comment is that it's important that somehow you reach out, make your voice heard. Not only to the Commission, but also to the European Parliament. Because we're living in a world of change, and change is going very fast. So therefore, I do recommend you to be in touch as much as possible, and to also to be less modest about your success stories. Make yourself known, so that people know how much innovation is happening in your sector. Because sometimes people have a very traditional view about what you're doing. And here you see in practice all the innovations that the sector is, and it's a very innovative sector. So therefore, be less modest, I would say. Reach out and tell us about your success stories, and tell the world about your success stories.
Wonderful, thank you. Be less modest, reach out, shout about your success stories. Thank you so much to all of you. We've reached the end of our session. I want a huge thank you to Wolfgang Münchau, to Hans Ingels, to Marco Eikelenboom, and Ilkka Hämälä. Please join me in thanking them for their time and their insight at this session. Thank you.